been asked to give a brief talk on the development of empathy, and it's really not feasible because it's a huge thing. So in spite of the fact that I've also been asked to do it very slowly, I'll try and give you at least some idea of what I wanted to say. But for those of you who find it very incomprehensible because I'm leaving out a lot of information, I've been assured that all these slides will be at the Vaincre l'Autisme website later on, so you can check whether you believe me or not on those slides. Empathy actually is a term that stems from the Greek word empatheia, which means sincerity, or some people have translated it as feeling. It was used by German doctors, and particularly by a guy called Theodor Lips around 1880, and then by Stein in her thesis on Zum Problem der Einfühlung, on the problem of empathy, which was supervised by the big guy Edmund Husserl. And it's about that time, about 1917, that it appears generally in the literature. And Freud used it repeatedly from about that time. And in 1921, he expressed his view that empathy was the capacity that all people have to take any perspective of other people. Well, I think Freud was basically almost right, but it's not in everybody's capacity to empathize with the perspectives of other people. But empathy, according to all these people, Lips and Stein and Husserl and Freud, is basically a cognitive, not an affective set. So what does it mean today? Most researchers and many clinicians, although by no means all, see empathy as the ability to have a theory of mind and to be able to reflect about the possible contents of the inner world, not just other people's inner world actually, but the inner worlds of all people, including oneself, and to have meta-representations about self and others. Empathy, according to Husserl, is the basis for so-called intersubjectivity. Sympathy, on the other hand, is affectively, positively colored empathy. So sympathy is not equivalent to empathy, but most people tend to use sympathy and empathy as though they were one and the same. Antipathy is affectively, negatively colored empathy. And in other words, my point here is don't use sympathy and empathy as synonymous terms. If you're talking about, for instance, disorders of empathy, you shouldn't be thinking about it as people, if you have a disorder of empathy, it's not necessarily about having a disorder of sympathy. You can actually be relatively sympathetic if you only have a tiny portion of empathy, and I'll come back to that. What about autism and its relation to empathy? Well, autism are all these terms that we use when we're talking about autism: Asperger's, autistic disorder, PDD, and you see all the various autisms that we talk about that are basically one and the same. The autisms, they are part of a broad group of neurodevelopmental disorders, and that would perhaps be better referred to as disorders of empathy. If you talk about empathy as a cognitive basic problem in these individuals. Empathy is probably a normally distributed trait, if you will, in the general population. And I suggested more than 20 years ago that empathy or an empathy quotient would be something that would be very similar to IQ, and that is normally distributed. And we could be talking about an empathy quotient. And the common denominator in empathy problems is a deficit, and particularly as we see autism today, in intuitive empathy, intuitive and active shared attention, and in spontaneous intersubjectivity. I think most people, from whatever perspective they come, would actually agree that this is what autism is all about, regardless of whether you call yourself this theorist or that theorist. What about psychopathy and empathy and sympathy? Well, psychopathy is characterized by the combination, according to Hare, and he's probably the most prolific writer in the field currently, the combination of being narcissistic, so-called borderline, and antisocial all at the same time. If you meet criteria according to the DSM, DSM-4, TR, or any of the other any of the other personality disorder cookbooks, narcissistic, borderline, and antisocial all at the same time will mean that you have psychopathy. What's particularly typical of psychopathy is the lack of remorse and the lack of conscience. Manipulation and or charm. People perceive this sometimes as charm. The manipulative powers of people with psychopathy are constant features of psychopathy. Empathy is a requirement for manipulation and charm, but it's also something which is leading to an activity that can make you really play on other people's minds, if you will. So the common denominator in psychopathy is not a lack of empathy, not at all, quite the opposite. You have to have a relatively well developed capacity for empathy in order to be able to become, as it were, a psychopath. Instead, the common denominator is a lack of sympathy and a lack of conscience and remorse in the presence of reasonable empathy skills. Autism and psychopathy, is there a link or not? Well, of course, people are different in the general population. So we're all born slightly or very differently and in all sorts of ways. So, of course, there are some people in the autism spectrum who have a little bit more of the cold and cold-hearted, as it were, bent, whereas there are also people born with the autistic sort of personality, if you will, who have this much warmer and sweeter personality. So just occasionally you will meet somebody with Asperger's syndrome, for instance, in adult age, where you feel, I'm not absolutely certain this isn't also a bit of psychopathy. But basically, the two concepts are totally different. So as a general rule, people with autism have deficient empathy. They have difficulty using spontaneous empathy throughout their lifespans. However, from about 10 years of age, when reminded, such as, for instance, when watching movies, very typically high-functioning people in the autism spectrum, when watching movies or hearing about things like natural disasters and abuse, etc., they can be very sympathetic, and they can actually develop a little bit of empathy and then be very sympathetic. But nevertheless, the deficit will continue to lead to inability to really manipulate other people in sophisticated ways. You very often see high-functioning people in the autism spectrum telling ridiculous lies and, you know, stories that nobody will believe who really knows about what happened. But just occasionally, teachers and others may be fooled by somebody telling an absolutely fantastic story, and they can go about doing various kinds of investigations. For instance, things like we've seen quite a number of children and young adults accusing other people of sexual abuse, for instance, that wasn't really anything to do with what actually happened. On the other hand, there's always the risk that this population is abused and not being believed. So these are very murky waters and tricky areas, but it's important to understand that a proportion of high-functioning people in the autism spectrum tell fantastic lies, and it can be difficult for people who don't know them and who don't know the setting to understand that this is actually not really true. But they're not sophisticated in their manipulative skills. And as a general rule, autism is nothing to do with conscience, whereas as a general rule, psychopathy is everything to do with conscience. Now, are there early markers for autism? This is what we're all looking for, isn't it? We're trying to establish whether children at risk for autism can be recognized very, very early in life. And as I've already told you, autism, once recognized early in life, in the first 3 years of life at least, is a stable trait, stable condition, stable disorder in most individuals, in that the person with autism will have autism 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line, in the vast majority of cases. Although the degree of autism and the diagnostic category in the field of autism may change over time, to the extent that 30 years later, it may be somebody starting out with autism, then being typical of Asperger's syndrome, and then being only, as it were, autistic traits in adult age. But autism predicts autism for a long, long time. Psychopathy, on the other hand, is usually not recognized at all until adult age. And it has early markers, including extremes of impulsivity, cruelty to animals, and to other children at a very early age. In the first 3 or 4 years of life, cruelty to animals and cruelty to other children are, in combination with extremes of impulsivity, definitely markers of a great risk for later conduct disorder, and hence a risk for psychopathy. There's a much weaker link with diagnosis such as oppositional defiant disorder early in life, and of ADHD early in life. But unfortunately, ODD and ADHD, if that's diagnosed early in life, there's quite a substantial proportion who will develop into individuals who will be perceived by others as having psychopathy, although the proportion is probably more like 15% or something than when sometimes people talk about ADHD on the road to criminality. This is going to be really bad. It's much greater a risk to have ADHD when it comes to later criminality, for instance, but it's certainly not the case that the majority of people with ADHD develop into criminal or psychopathic people. And so ASD also is almost never a forerunner of anything that we could call psychopathy. So how does empathy develop over time? Well, we probably only know a little bit about how this comes about, and we only know a little bit about it really in visually and hearing competent children. We know very little about it in visually and hearing impaired children, and I'm not going to go into this today. I'm not sure. It does say under this motor development that motor skills are needed in order to be able to actually show that you are developing empathy. So it's very difficult to judge anybody's development in this field unless there are some motor skills. So I'm also assuming here that the child has, even if not normal motor skills, certainly some motor skills. There's a need for memory to be in at least some sort of order, for perceptions to be made, and for attentive skills to be at least present. There is a need for impulse control and looking at eyes in order to develop empathy in the first 3, 4, 5 years of life. There's something some people refer to as the eye direction detector, which probably is a very important aspect of early development. Looking at the things that other people look at is probably very important in order to develop the same sort of concept of the world that other people have. But that probably holds also for hearing. So a hearing direction detector is probably also something that is important in developing empathy. But the eye direction detector has, up until now, been more studied. Self-initiated joint attention that I spoke about this morning is something which you can see very clearly signs of at about 8 months of age. And even in 6-month-old babies, if they're relatively intelligent, you can see self-initiated joint attention. And if you don't see any self-initiated joint attention by 12 or 14 or 16 months, it's probably a big sort of sign that you should be worried. Language, and here it's very important to understand that all of us, I think, believe that all people tend to look, well, I've been promised that I can do a little bit more. Okay. All people believe that looking at the eyes is what all people do from the beginning of life. And it's true that the majority of babies actually do look at other people's upper portions of the faces when they're newborn and when they're a bit older. And then it's true that when they're like 5 and 10 and 25, they also prefer to look at other people's eyes for interpreting what's going on in the minds or what's going on in the inner worlds of other people. But we just completed a study of perfectly normal babies and following them up at 2.5, showing that it's the normal thing for 2.5-year-olds to prefer looking at the mouth. So this, I think, is important in terms of understanding that maybe autism is about, I mean, just like in normal babies, you look at the mouth when language development is is at its fastest speed in order to understand what's going on. And this is what perhaps continues to be the case in autism, but it's not something that at 2.5 can be used as a predictor for autism because it occurs in virtually everybody. And then gradually, theory of mind emerges on the basis of these other things: the motor, the memory, the perceptual, the attention, the impulse control, looking at eyes, etc., self-initiated joint attention, and the integration with executive function and central coherence will be important in order to use theory of mind in the context so that you can have real empathy and understanding of what goes on in other people's minds. In the past 10 years, a lot of fuss has been made about mirror neurons and their possible meaning in all of this. But the problem is that it's very unlikely that this is going to be the main sort of one pathway thing to empathy and particularly to autism. And I won't go into detail here because I don't have time, but I must say I think even though mirror neuron research is very interesting and very exciting, I think those who believe that here we have the solution to empathy, I don't think that's very likely going to be the case. So I can't go into, because of time restraints, much detail when it comes to why motor is important, why perceptual is important, but certainly children with autism, children who have empathy problems have unusual reaction to sensory stimuli, and they have inability to perceptually distinguish important from unimportant information. And attention, of course, attention is extremely important. If you're not attending to what's going on in the world because you have ADHD, for instance, of course there will be some problem with your empathic skills. You may have the basic capacity to develop empathy, but if you're never attending to anything, you won't develop it. So again, it's very important to try and help young children who have clear attentional problems to have some help for their attentional problems so that they can develop better empathy skills. ADHD is associated with a lot of social impairment in early life, and some of it looks a lot like autism. And there is a large group of children with ADHD who actually have very clear autistic features. And we know now from genetic research and our twin studies that they very often come together in families. But I think it's important to try and distinguish basic empathy skills from attentional skills, even though, of course, attention in itself contributes to the development of empathy. Impulse control. Unless you can control your impulses, you will have a hard time developing good empathy skills. Everybody can understand this. If you're constantly driven, as in Tourette's syndrome, by new impulses all the time, how can you really attend again to what other people's inner minds are all about? And looking at the eyes, I already mentioned it's typical of newborns, but it's typical of some children with autism, but also of normal children at 24 months. Well, I think I'll leave this because I've already mentioned it. Theory of mind is clearly relatively well developed in 5-year-old children. Some children have clear evidence of what we call theory of mind before that, and others have a little later emerging clear evidence of this. And it's rather obvious, I think, from the research that has been published, that the vast majority of people in the autism spectrum have these types of problem with theory of mind in this age group, when they're 5, when they're 6, but quite a lot do relatively well on theory of mind tasks when they're 10 and upwards. And I think the whole thing about integrating executive functions, central coherence, and theory of mind is essential for developing empathy. So where in the brain is empathy? Well, the default mode network is the medial, as I said this morning, prefrontal, temporal, brainstem, and cerebellar areas of the brain. These areas are connected in a very predictable functional neural network that is most active when we are introspecting, reflecting about the past and the future, and reflecting on other people's mental states. And the functional connectivity between this, within this system and between this system and other hubs, as it were, in the brain, are extremely important, probably, in the development of empathy. And there are some very interesting papers by these people that anybody interested in the development of empathy and where in the brain it might be should get access to. I think it's very interesting that even about 30 years ago, a lot of us published work on brainstem abnormalities in autism. Others published work on the cerebellum and its importance in autism. We published work on the temporal lobes and how important they are in autism. We published a SPECT study 22 years ago in which we showed that every single individual with autism had decreased activity in the bitemporal portions of the brain. And Francesca and our group and others have shown that the medial frontal portions of the brain are very often involved in high-functioning people with autism. And for a long time, people felt that, what's this? It's there and there and there and there, but it's got nothing to do with each other. But actually, if you look at all the studies that have been done to date in autism, this functional network, the default network, is implicated in all of those studies. Because if you disrupt that system anywhere, in the frontal lobes, in the cerebellum, in the brainstem, in the temporal lobes, the whole system will be less functional. And so maybe that's the basis both of empathy problems and particularly of autism. Thank you very much.